Since at least the 19th century, as we all know, artists have repeatedly responded critically to the teaching methods of the art academies. And this talk takes as its point of departure one specific case that can be situated within this broader history of critique, and Johannes Itten's art school in Vienna. My discussion is based on a corpus of student sketches by an artist called Edith Granström, married Knaffel-Lenz. Until now, the knowledge about Itten's art school in Vienna has mainly relied on his own diaries, as his sort of annotations and his perspective on what was going on there, and where he sort of broadly conceptualized his teaching in terms of content, structure, and method. And by contrast, it's quite little known about how those ideas were implemented in practice at the art school from the student's perspective. So this talk focuses in particular on the structure and content of the courses and on the analytical exercises developed within them, including studies of old master paintings, rhythm and proportion exercises, and, as we will see, stenographic drawings. Granström's material will be used throughout this talk as kind of guiding thread, and I will conclude this presentation with a brief reflection on how this training may have shaped her subsequent trajectory. So I don't think Johannes Itten really needs a presentation, but very briefly, he received his initial training in Switzerland before moving to Stuttgart in 1913, where he first studied privately for Ida Kerkovius before entering the Meisterklasse under Adolf Hölzer at the Königliche Akademie der Bildenden Künste. And in 1916 he relocated to Vienna, where he soon established his own art school. And it was here in Vienna that he developed his didactic model that later became so influential. His approach focused on basic design principles, material exploration, and the training of artistic perception. And this system then formed the basis for the innovative Fokus, the preliminary course at the Bauhaus in Weimar, which he joined in 1919 at the invitation of Walter Gropius. And after leaving the Bauhaus in 1923, Itten continued to apply those methods at his own art school in Berlin in the 1920s and 30s, and also as a director of the Kunstgewerbeschule in Zurich in the 40s and 50s. And finally, when he refined, you could say, his influential color theory throughout his career, but perhaps fully articulated for the first time in the book he published in 1961, Kunst der Farbe. So, the second main protagonist here is Edith Granström Knaffel-Lenz. And she was born in central Sweden in a family where her father was a factory manager. She took initial drawing studies in Stockholm and attended a private art school there in the early 1900s. She then moved to Munich in order to study for Angelo Jank at the Damenakademie in Munich, and also took summer courses for Julius Exter in Chiemsee, which is nearby. She then went on to Paris, where she first studied at the Académie de la Grande Juliette for Lucien Simon mainly, but she was dissatisfied with the education there, so she moved on to the Académie Vitti and studied under the Spanish painter Caramasa, and also made sure to study in detail the work of Cézanne in the collection of Auguste Pellerin. She made her debut in Gävle in Sweden in 1909, which was followed by a solo exhibition the year after. In 1911, she married the Austrian pharmacologist Erich Knappe-Denz and moved to Vienna. And before moving, she also had the chance to participate in the exhibition of Föreningen Svenska Konstnärinnor, the Association of Swedish Women Artists at the Royal Academy of Arts in Stockholm in 1911. And I could add here that I would argue that this is actually one of the first feminist exhibitions, a women-only exhibition, which also had a historical section, so documenting women on the past, very much like the shows that Linda Locklin made in the 1970s later on. So it's an interesting context. In Vienna, she remained active in women artists networks, and she served on the board of the Vereinigung Bildende Künstlerinnen Österreichs, the BKÖ, and participated in several of their exhibitions, both in Austria and also abroad. And then in 1917, she joined Itten's art school. And she remained there until he left for Weimar in 1919. So, what about this material then that is in focus here? I first came across the sketches of the Granström when I was researching her involvement with the Association of Swedish Women Artists and also the Vereinigung in Vienna. And a reference suggested that her papers were preserved in an archive, and I initially expected to find correspondences and other documents relating to her professional network and her career. Instead, the material consisted exclusively of sketches. This was, I have to admit, at first a bit disappointing. I thought that I would find things in order to write the history of her career or whatever, find her, be able to map out her networks and things like that. But then I started to browse through the sketches, and I soon realized that almost all of them appeared to date from her period at Itten's art school in Vienna. And here, at this point, I should emphasize that I have not yet been able to look through all the material, partly due to limited access to the archive, which is in the foundation of Hilmar Klint. You'll get an explanation of that later on. And the corpus that I've been working with consists of some 350 or 400 sketches, which are photographed in the archive, but I think that there might be a couple of hundred more sketches which I have not had the chance to go through yet. I should also immediately admit that I am not sure yet what I'm going to do with this material. I have not decided for a specific methodological approach or a theoretical framework. I am quite frankly happy to be here in order to present this material to you today, because I think I'm asking you that we can think together perhaps at the end of this talk, what can we do with this kind of material? I'm happy for any kind of feedback or comments. So that's the material. About the art school, Itten Art School in Vienna. At the suggestion of an artist called Agathe Mark-Kornfeldt, a Viennese artist that was also Itten's student, one of his earliest students in Stuttgart, when he was still with Adolf Hölzer. He began to develop his own teaching practice in Vienna in 1916. And this initially took the form of private lessons in small and informal groups that he held in his rented studio flat. And the teaching soon expanded, and from the second half of 1917 he organized it more systematically as structured courses in a rented studio. The students in this school, we don't know the exact number. There are no sort of a list of students who entered. We don't know the identity of them all, but contemporary accounts suggest that there were at least some 20 students, and among the earliest participants in 1916 was Agatha von Kornfeld, Friedel Dicker, who would later follow Itten to Bauhaus in Weimar. There was 16, I think, of his Vienna students followed him when he moved on to Weimar in 1919. There were also 2 members of the Vereinigung Bildende Künstler Österreichs, Maria Syrenius and Elisabeth Lasker-Kesselbauer. And these 2 members likely played a key role in introducing Itten in this women's network, or in this context. And it was probably in this context that Granström first encountered him. He gave a guest lecture entitled Überkomposition at the premises of the women artist in Vienna in 1917, and soon after Edith Granström joined his course. So I think Itten's pedagogical model must be understood against the backdrop of sustained criticism against the art academies that developed throughout the 19th century. And this critique reached its peak in the early 20th century, coinciding with Itten's endeavors in Vienna and later Weimar. And like many art historians and critics in German-speaking Europe at the time, Itten grounded his didactics in ideas associated with the Lebensreform movement, which advocated a broad cultural and spiritual renewal. At a time when academic training still largely upheld the ideal of the male genius and understood practice as a vocation, Itten instead argued that anyone who could liberate their creative potential could become an artist. His aim was to develop a comprehensive approach to art education. Teaching, in his sense, wasn't restricted to artistic training, but were conceived as a form of human formation intended to foster the students' holistic development. So after relocating to Vienna, it is well known that Itten also became increasingly engaged with theosophical thought, which further informed his understanding of art practice and art education. In what follows, I will not focus on those theoretical foundations, though, but on how he developed and structured the teaching methods and pedagogical models. What was perhaps most distinctive in his approach was his use of reproductions of the old master paintings in his teaching. This might come as a surprise. This again must be seen against the criticism directed at the art academies, where copying was widely regarded as problematic. The main objection concerned the tendency to focus on isolated details such as hand or feet in order to learn correct drawing. You can see an example from this kind of education, a sketch by Swedish artist Anders Kleven to the left here. And Itten developed a different approach. Rather than fragmenting the image, he insisted on the importance of studying artworks as coherent wholes in order to understand compositional structure and pictorial idiom. Where academic copying was often associated with the cultivation of taste, Itten, like his teacher Adolf Hölzel in Stuttgart, sought instead to draw the students' attention to the artistic means. Hölzel had emphasized that students should learn to recognize and apply the fundamental principle of pictorial composition, including line, volume, shape, color, perspective, and light and shade. He also introduced systematical visual analysis of old masters into the curriculum, training students to decode the visual grammar of the images. Itten's copying exercises were not intended to reproduce the technique of old masters in the sense of imitation. Rather, they aimed first to awaken the students' own sense of form, and second, to develop the students' ability to immerse themselves in an artwork and grasp its essential structure. The idea was that students should, in a sense, relive or empathetically experience the work of old masters through drawing and embodied engagement. And it was only later, in his contribution to the Utopia Almanac, published in Weimar in 1921, that Itten formulated this approach in explicit programmatic terms. So copying, in his sense, was not imitation, but a way of refining the eye and the hand for what is essential, not only to see it, but also to sense it. As he put it, and I quote, "Students should always begin by copying so that the movements of the masters are absorbed into their own hands." End of quote. And this is an approach that also underpins his analytical exercises with old masters' work. So you could say that his didactic approach rested on a distinction between simply looking and observing analytically. He selected paradigmatic artworks and concentrated exclusively on their formal elements, largely detached from the historical context of their production and reception. The aim of these exercises was to teach the students how to see, how to deconstruct a painting and uncover its underlying pictorial structure in detail. At the same time, the emphasis on immersion in the artwork also appears to have involved an emotional dimension. One of Edith Granström's sketches, probably made during an introductory lecture on the analysis of old masters, bears the inscription "Vortrag Itten, Anfang zur Analyse alter Meister, Gefühlte gezeichnet, Kontraste im Gefühl." So, a lecture by Itten, Introduction to the Analysis of Old Masters, drawn by emotion, contrasts of feeling. This suggests, I argue, that the visual analysis wasn't conceived as a purely intellectual exercise. Analytical observation and emotional experience were understood as closely interconnected aspects of artistic perception. Itten organized his teaching in Vienna into three main courses. The first one was called Anfänger, the beginner's course. Then came Rhythmiker, a course on rhythm. And the third and last course was called Hell-Dunkel-Klasse, so a course on the relation between light and shadow. And Granström's sketches strongly suggest that she attended all three of those courses, and since the material is almost entirely undated and it was not systematically organized when it was incorporated into the Hilma af Klint archive, they're very difficult to make firm conclusions, of course, but the label folders have a certain structure, even though it's not a clear chronological structure, and it may of course well have been rearranged over the years. Even so, I think that the character of the sketches makes it impossible to identify material that appears to derive from each of the 3 different courses, despite also the fact that I have not examined the material in its entirety. So in the beginner's course, students trained their perceptual abilities through what Itten described as photographically accurate drawings from life. And the aim here was to translate and internalize careful observation and sensory experience into embodied practice. As Itten himself stated, I start by training the physical body, hand, arm, shoulder, and the senses, end of quote. Students were then introduced to exercises in composition, rhythm, and movement. And I think that these kind of exercises are the ones that are found in the folder that Granström labeled concentration exercises, as you can see here. And judging from the material in this folder, they involved identifying the basic formal structure of different images, reproductions that he employed in the education. Old master paintings were frequently used for those exercises, although in a few exceptional cases students also worked from modern artists such as Matisse. One example can be seen here in the sketch to the right. That is not after a modern artist, but after Memling, and where she had noted also that she had tried to focus on the main Hauptmotiv, Nebenmotiv, proportion, form, character, Rhythmus, trying to sort of map the basic pictorial idiom of this image, the original image. Itten also asked students to select reproductions for their exercises themselves, partly as a way of assessing their personalities. Based on the selections that the students made, he divided them into emotionally oriented Rembrandt personalities, or more intellectually inclined Nordic characters. Apparently, Maria Sirenius and Erik Granström became paradigmatic examples of these 2 types. According to Itten, Granström's earlier work reflected a linear and non-sensuous disposition, which sort of would align her to this sort of intellectual Nordic type. The first course also included exercises analyzing the distribution of light and shadow, clearly derived from the teaching Itten himself had received from Arnold Hölzel in Stuttgart. Students sketched from old master paintings in order to schematically map how light and shadow were organized across the picture planes in cohesive masses, and to reduce these relations into abstract patterns of contrast. The second course focused on visual dynamics and pictorial rhythm, exploring how artistic means generate movement and structure within the image. When light and shadow were addressed in this course, it was primarily in relation to the rhythmic function within the composition. Students carried out proportion exercises in which the distribution of light and shadow in the original was reduced to abstract fields arranged in horizontal or vertical bands. Granström's material shows how this procedure was developed through exercising in extracting of light and dark ratios of the painting under analysis. Reproductions of paintings were translated into sequences of horizontal bands rendered in black pencil, shaded in grey tones, or left completely blank. This reduction foreground how contrast and transitions between light and dark structure the painting's composition, and more generally, the analytical exercises involved not only sustained observation and drawing, but also the extraction of specific formal elements from the image. Through this process, the sketches themselves acquired a markedly abstract quality. So, for example, the sketch to the right in this slide here is a sketch from an old master painting that I've not yet been able to identify. I'm sure you can see why there is a certain difficulty in doing that here. But there are other sketches from peers at the art school, and also from Itten himself, when he worked with this kind of sort of abstraction, and where you can sort of pair an abstract sketch with an original old master painting.
Sorry, does that say Titian? Titian?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, it is, and Giotto and Titian. So mapping out how some paintings of theirs sort of have a distribution of light and shadow, and how it's reduced in this band of shades and light and darkness. Okay. The course in pictorial rhythms, the second course, also included studies of basic geometric forms and their interaction, alongside exercises in extracting elementary shapes from old master paintings, and live drawing formed another important component. Students first worked from closed models, and only later from the nude, although the aim was not naturalistic representation, but rather the articulation of what Itten termed the figure's emotional skeleton. And as you can see, there are only a few of those nude drawings that have survived, I believe, if there are not more of them in the material that I haven't seen yet. But they are usually very stylized, focusing on only on sort of the most important shapes and essential gestures sort of to capture the model in this way. So, the distribution of light and shade and the contrast between light and dark in old master paintings had been central to Adolf Hölzer's teaching and became equally important in Johannes Itten's Vienna courses. In the third course, students developed a mode of advanced understanding of these relations, building on the exercises of the earlier courses. In 1918, Itten also introduced a new method, the so-called stenogram drawings, a pictorial equivalent to shorthand writing. Based on paintings, these exercises aim to capture the essential structure of the image in a highly condensed format. Unlike the more strictly analytical exercises, the stenogram drawings allowed greater room for individual interpretation and creative response in the individual student. They therefore also function as a kind of emotional transcript of the student. So, for this reason, Itten adopted the choice of source material according to whether he perceived the student as this emotional Rembrandt personality, or there would be another selection of paintings if he considered the student being of an intellectual Nordic type. It remains somewhat unclear exactly how these exercises were carried out. In Granström's folder from the course, there are several sketches that at first appear to just be abstract compositions, but which were likely produced as scenographic studies after reproductions. Composed of rapidly drawn lines and simplified forms, they attempt to condense the essence of a reference image into a highly reduced visual notation. And only in exceptional cases is it possible to determine that those sketches relate to a specific motif at all. This sketch, for example, is quite clear that it's a landscape, and you can also see how she worked with an inner frame within the format of the paper. But in most of these drawings, it's impossible. They are quite they remind you sometimes of Kandinsky's abstract compositions, actually, or something like that. So, alongside the three principal courses, Itten also offered instruction in subjects such as geometry, compositional formulas, and philosophical theory. Granström's material includes, for example, a folder also from a color theory course containing watercolor studies of color styles, pastel exercises in color harmony, and collages made from colored paper exploring contrasts, gradations, and tonal variation. Another folder in this material is labeled Composition, and it contains sketches that clearly demonstrate how Itten transmitted the method derived from Adolf Hölzel. Several of the sketches in this folder are marked explicitly as compositions executed according to Hölzel's model or method. They have small written notations where it says Hölzel-Schumann in several of those. And you can also see, of course, the lines, the diagonal and horizontal and vertical lines there of how the composition is structured, which was a way that Hölzel was sort of concentrating on building the painting in this way. And Itten had learned how to structure compositions through this kind of underlying linear frameworks. And he later recalled how Hölzel typically worked from a geometrically structured linear grid in order to establish from the outset compositional focal points determined by the picture plane and its boundaries. The structure, according to Itten, was consistently built on axis and diagonal lines. And these are the models that Granström's sketches also follow in this folder. So, I will say just something very short on the content of the course in terms of the selection of reproductions. Until now, I've just been speaking in very generic terms about old masters and old master paintings, the occasional Matisse, but Itten naturally developed a very personal selection of artworks, and it was also very clear from the material what kind of artist he would work with, preferably what his inclination was. And like his teacher Hölzel, he was very fond of Giotto, as many other artists at the time. He had sort of a kind of renaissance or revival during this time. Giotto, there are also quite a lot of sketches after compositions of paintings by Greco, Matthias Grünewald, and other sort of Nordic, medieval, early Renaissance painters. Matisse, you can see in this sketch here by Granström, is one of the few sketches. This is going back to a painting by Matisse on a bridge. I'm sorry, it slipped my mind the name of the bridge now. It's a painting, it's a recognized identified painting. Matisse is perhaps the only contemporary artist that Itten refers to in his teaching. And not quite contemporary, but relatively modern, is also Cézanne, which was a great influence, and which also was an artist that Granström herself was very interested in, as I said, already during her time in Paris. So, before I wrap up, I think that I would like to say something about the training under Itten and the effect it had. Did it shape her artistic career in any way? That is actually a very difficult question to answer, since there are so very few traces of her artistic production that have survived. I've found in some sources information that says that she preferred to work on paper, in watercolors or in pastel colors, which explains why there are so few, or may explain why there are so few works of her hand in public collections, because they are less likely to enter those collections. Granström herself, though, she described the 3 years at Itten Art School in Vienna as her most important formative period. She fully embraced his reform pedagogy, and during a temporary return to Sweden in 1920, she even founded a painting school in Stockholm based on Itten's methods. Her own work, though, remains largely unexplored, as I said, only a few pieces are preserved in public collections. So as a result, knowledge of her own artistic practice relies mainly on contemporary criticism and also illustrations in the daily press. So I'm not sure if this, it's hard to see from this image here, but this is a page from the Wiener Illustrated Zeitung from 1920, and the landscape painting in the lower left is a painting by Granström, which was part of an exhibition in Vienna at the time. Already in the early 1910s, she was consistently described in the press as part of the most progressive strand of modern art. And in connection with the Vienna exhibition in 1919, it was even noted that she was completely absorbed by Itten. However, the few works that can be traced today do not confirm this view. They appear surprisingly conventional, especially in light of her training. And here again, I must admit, some kind of disappointment when I went to Vienna, very excited about to see some of the works in the public collection there, and I came across those landscape paintings, and those are even the most radical ones by a hand. I've chosen the best one in this case, so you understand. It's very confusing in a way, also with respect to the education and training by Itten, and also how deeply influenced she was on his way of structuring images, on his the abstract experiments that she carried out during this education. So, while still in Vienna, Granström also encountered anthroposophy through Itten. And in 1922, she met Rudolf Steiner, in Vienna and immediately joined the Anthroposophical Society. And until the 1950s, she regularly visited the Anthroposophical Center, Gutianum, in Donach, in Switzerland, and she also had a solo exhibition there in 1935. That same year, she returned permanently to Sweden. She re-established a painting school in Stockholm, but she also became the chair of the Swedish Anthroposophical Society, a position which she held until her death in 1956. And this is also the explanation why her archive is now in the Hilma Klint archive, because the Anthroposophical Society sort of had connections here. And during the 1930s, she expanded her teaching practices or activities to Norway and Finland. She offered courses in Goethe's and Steiner's color theories. Itten had introduced her to Goethe's color theory already in Vienna. And in connection with courses in Helsinki, which were reportedly well received both by the amateurs and the professional artists that attended, she exhibited both figurative and abstract paintings at the well-known art gallery Salon Strindberg in the 1930s. Critics at the time noted a clear reference in her abstract paintings to Goethe's theory and Steiner's ideas. And so it seems that although her activities in the 1930s was mainly to focus on teaching, her own artistic practice seems to have been closely aligned with the kind of theoretical thoughts that she transmitted. So to conclude then, or not really conclude, I am afraid I will not be able to provide a proper conclusion, but because I'm still hesitant about how to assess the material I came across here, and I just have a sort of final few reflections. As far as I can see, the didactic approach developed by Itten in Vienna and later context doesn't represent a clean break with academic tradition. It can rather be understood as a transformation of academic training into perceptual and procedural protocols that simulate rupture while at the same time establishes new norms. The analytical exercises in which students were trained in sustained observation of old master paintings can thus be seen as a form of disciplinary looking or a way of disciplinating the gaze. More broadly, Itten's teaching aimed to train students to see, to feel, and to articulate what he understood as the essence of the image. This involved not only a restructuring of perception, but also an embodied and habitual practice developed through drawing. In contrast to academic models based on imitation and the ideal of transcendent as a transcendent artistic genius, Itten's didactics focused on analysis, deconstruction, and the recovery of formal structure, while at the same time promoting the idea of latent creativity in every individual. In this context, exercises were to some extent individualized. Works were selected according to these different temperaments, the Rembrandt personalities or the Nordic ones. The material by Erik Granström makes this particularly tangible. Her sketches not only document exercises, but also show how these categories were transformed into practice, from fragmentary analysis of old masters to highly condensed rhythmic and tonal studies, and finally to the stenographic drawings that oscillate between analysis and expression. In this sense, the archive doesn't simply preserve exercises, but also traces how pedagogical principles were internalized and reconfigured at the level of individual practice. The ultimate aim of this approach may be described as a formation of a sensorial way of engaging with the world, closely related to ideals of physical and spiritual self-cultivation associated with the Lebensreform movement. So I think that the training process can therefore be understood as a kind of embodied knowledge production. At the same time, it's important to note that although Itten's avant-garde modes of instruction sort of reform or even displace the traditional art academy, it didn't aim to negate its foundation entirely. Rather than a post-traditional break, Itten's method might more accurately be described as para-traditional, a practice that remains in dialogue with earlier academic structure, while simultaneously extending and reconfiguring them.